Imagine waking up in a country where the most basic human necessity, water, simply stops. To understand the fix, we have to understand the collapse. America's water crisis is actually two separate disasters.
So, how do you spend $1 trillion? The fix is a combination of brutal engineering and Star Trek technology.
This isn't just about plumbing, it's about power. If the $1 trillion fix fails, we will see the first.
The United States was built on the mastery of its landscape. Now, it must master its most precious resource.
One river.
For Ethiopia, this dam is a declaration, a symbol of self-determination, the infrastructure project that was going to end their century of energy poverty. But Egypt sees something different. Egypt sees a slow-moving catastrophe, and in January 2026, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the President of the United States sat across from Egypt's leader and called this dam a very dangerous issue. So which is it? Africa's greatest triumph of modern infrastructure, or the mega project most likely to ignite the continent's
We need a
first
resolution
full-scale
now.
water war. Today, we follow the money, the river, and the geopolitics, all the way to the answer. To understand why the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is one of the most consequential pieces of infrastructure on Earth, you first have to understand what it actually is. The GERD sits on the Blue Nile, at a point where the river drops sharply from the Ethiopian highlands into the lowland plains of Sudan. It is, by almost any engineering measure, extraordinary point 6,450 megawatts. That is roughly the equivalent of 6 nuclear power plants running simultaneously. Before this dam came online, approximately 67 million Ethiopians, nearly 60% of the population, had no access to reliable electricity. Think carefully about what that means in practice. Hospitals running on diesel generators that fail during operations. Factories unable to operate in night shift. Refrigeration unreliable. Internet infrastructure impossible to scale. An entire nation's economic ambitions constrained by a chronic structural energy deficit. Ethiopia's GDP per capita is approximately $1,100. It is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, but that growth has always been capped by one simple bottleneck. Not enough power. The GERD was designed to break that bottleneck permanently, and not just for Ethiopia. At full operational capacity, Ethiopia is projected to produce a significant surplus, enough to export electricity to Djibouti, Sudan, Kenya, and eventually beyond. Ethiopia is positioning itself to become East Africa's primary power exporter, a geopolitical posture with enormous long-term implications. Construction began in April 2011 and was originally projected to take 6 years. It took 14. Funding crises, seasonal floods, a devastating civil war in the Tigray region that disrupted supply routes directly to the construction site, a global pandemic, and still, it was built. The first turbines came online in 2022. By 2024, the dam was generating power at scale. By 2025, it had already changed Ethiopia's national energy equation more than any project in the country's history. This is a genuine engineering achievement by any standard. But the GERD doesn't exist in an empty landscape. It sits on one of the most politically contested rivers in the world, and that changes everything. The Nile is the longest river in the world. It flows 6,650 kilometers, drains 11 countries, and sustains the lives of approximately 500 million. But here is the number that explains this entire conflict. Egypt uses 97% of its fresh water from a single source, the Nile. And here's the second part. Roughly 85% of that water doesn't originate in Egypt. It doesn't even originate in Sudan. It falls as monsoon rain in the highlands of Ethiopia, flows into the Blue Nile, and travels north through Sudan, through Egypt, and into the Mediterranean Sea. Ethiopia generates most of the water. Historically, Ethiopia has received none of the legal rights to it. This arrangement is not an accident of geography. It is the direct result of colonial-era law. The 1929 Nile Waters Agreement, negotiated under British colonial administration, largely to protect British agricultural investments in Egypt, gave Egypt and Sudan formal water allocations and, critically, gave Egypt effective veto power over any upstream water projects. The upstream nations, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, received no legal allocation whatsoever. Ethiopia was not present in the negotiations. The British signed on behalf of what was then the Egyptian administration. For nearly a century, this arrangement held, not because it was fair, but because no upstream nation had the financial capacity or political will to challenge it. The GERD changes that calculation fundamentally. The dam's reservoir holds 74 billion cubic meters. Filling it took several years. And during filling, a measurable volume of water that would otherwise have flowed downstream was held back. The ongoing impact is more nuanced. Some water is permanently lost to evaporation from the reservoir surface. The filling cycle affects seasonal flows. And during drought years, when the Blue Nile runs lower than average, the dam's operational rules determine how much water Ethiopia prioritizes for power generation versus downstream flow. Egypt's per capita annual freshwater availability has already fallen below 700 cubic meters. The international threshold for what the United Nations defines as absolute water scarcity is 1,000 cubic meters. Egypt is already operating in a water deficit. Its population is projected to reach 150 million by 2050. Its agricultural demand is growing. Its Nile Delta is experiencing salinization as sea levels rise and freshwater pressure decreases. From Cairo's perspective, this is not a policy debate. It is an existential question, and a dam 1,000 kilometers upstream, with no binding legal framework governing its operations, is an existential variable they cannot control. Let's be precise about what has been said publicly, because in geopolitics, words matter. In 2020, at a White House press conference, then President Donald Trump was asked about the GERD dispute. His response? They will blow up that dam. He was not issuing an American threat. He was characterizing what he believed Egypt might eventually do. But those words landed like a strategic signal in Cairo, in Addis Ababa, and in every foreign ministry tracking East African stability. Then, 6 years later at Davos in January 2026, Trump met Egyptian President el-Sisi. He described the dam as a very dangerous issue. He stated that Egypt was being denied water it has relied on for millions of years. And he committed to personally brokering a resolution between Cairo and Addis Ababa. This is diplomatically significant for 3 distinct reasons. First, it signals that the United States views the Nile dispute as a genuine regional flashpoint, not merely a bilateral African quarrel. Second, it introduces renewed American diplomatic pressure at a moment when talks have been effectively stalled since 2020, when Ethiopia withdrew from U.S.-brokered negotiations. Third, it places this dam at the center of great power competition in East Africa, because this dispute does not exist in isolation. China has been Ethiopia's largest infrastructure partner for 2 decades. Beijing has a strong commercial interest in Ethiopian economic growth, not because of the dam specifically, but because Ethiopia's industrialization is central to China's long-term positioning across the East Africa. Russia has been deepening its military and diplomatic presence in Sudan, the middle nation in this equation, caught between its dependence on Ethiopian water management and its strategic alignment with Egypt.
The stakes are
Khartoum
clear
has
for
shifted
Cairo
its
and
position
Addis
on the GERD
Ababa.
multiple times,
We must find common
often
ground
reflecting
on water rights
which
and
external
regional
power
stability.
has more leverage at a given moment. The United Arab Emirates, which holds significant commercial interest across the Horn of Africa, has been quietly attempting parallel mediation, and underneath all of this sits a legal vacuum. The 1929 treaty is a colonial relic with no modern enforcement mechanism. The 2010 Cooperative Framework Agreement, which 6 upstream nations signed to replace the colonial framework with an equitable alternative, was rejected by Egypt and Sudan. International water law has no binding global authority. The International Court of Justice cannot compel compliance. There is no Nile River equivalent
The water
of
is
the World
lower
Trade
this year.
Organization. What
Yes, we
governs the
worry
Nile
about the
today
crops.
is not law. It is power, economic leverage, military capacity, and diplomatic alignment. And that balance is actively shifting. Ethiopia's defense budget is approximately $800 million annually. Egypt's is $5.3 billion, the largest in the African continent. The conventional military gap is significant. But Egypt cannot destroy a dam 1,000 kilometers inside Ethiopian territory without triggering a regional conflict with consequences no party can fully control. And Ethiopia cannot manage its dam in complete isolation from 105 million downstream Egyptians without bearing the political and humanitarian cost of what follows. Both countries know this, which is why the conflict has remained so far below the threshold of direct military action. The question is whether it stays there. Strip away the diplomatic theater, and what you are looking at is a collision between two legitimate economic imperatives. Ethiopia's position is straightforward. We build infrastructure on a river that flows through our own territory, using money raised from our own citizens to address a genuine development crisis. We are not responsible for a treaty we never signed. We are not going to ask permission for development. And the economics support Ethiopia's case more than most international coverage authorities. When the dam reaches full operational capacity, Ethiopia is projected to earn over $1 billion annually from electricity exports alone. For a country with a GDP of roughly $130 billion, that is a transformational income stream, the equivalent of discovering a new major industry without extracting a single resource. More importantly, domestic electricity access restructures Ethiopia's entire industrial opportunity. Core manufacturers from China, Turkey, and Europe require reliable power before they will commit to large-scale factory investment. Ethiopia has been competing with Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Cambodia for low-cost manufacturing contracts for a decade. The Hawassa Industrial Park, one of Africa's largest export-oriented manufacturing zones, already produces garments for major European and American retail brands. But its capacity has been constrained by chronic power supply unreliability. The GERD changes that competitive position significantly. And here is the broader economic argument that rarely appears in Western coverage of this story. East Africa has a structural energy deficit. Over 600 million people on the continent lack access to reliable electricity. Kenya imports power. Djibouti imports power. South Sudan has almost no grid infrastructure whatsoever. The GERD creates a surplus supply node at the geographic center of East Africa. That is not just good for Ethiopia, it is strategically important for regional development. Now the downside, because there is a real one, and it belongs to people who had no vote in this. Egyptian farmers in the Nile Delta are already facing falling groundwater levels, shrinking agricultural zones, and increasing soil salinity. These are not statistics. These are farming families whose livelihoods depend on a water supply that is already under pressure, and any additional reduction compounds a crisis that is already underway. In Sudan, the calculation is genuinely complex. The GERD's flood control functionality actually reduces the severity of the seasonal Nile floods that historically damage Sudanese farmland. But Sudan's political alignment with Egypt and its existing bilateral water agreements creates pressure to oppose the dam even when the hydrological impact on Sudan may, in several respects, be positive. What no serious analyst disputes is this. The dam is built. It is operational. It is generating power. That reality cannot be reversed. The question is no longer whether the GERD gets built. The question is whether three nations, and the international community that has interests in all of them, can construct a governance framework for the 21st century that no longer depends on a colonial agreement from 1929.
The situation in the Nile Basin is reaching a critical point.
Yes, the security implications cannot be overstated. We must proceed carefully.
We demand action now! We will not be silenced!
As you can see, the crowds are chanting slogans of maximalist position.
We have an anomaly on the graph here.
Rerouting the data stream for analysis. Everything remains within operational parameters.
Both countries maintain the conflict below the threshold of military action because the costs of escalation are too high for both economies. Periodic diplomatic crises, triggered by drought years or disputed filling cycles, flare and recede.
This is the most probable near-term outcome. We are monitoring the situation closely and urge all parties to remain calm.
It is also, long-term, the most fragile flank, because it depends on neither side being pushed.
Reduces Egyptian Nile flows to levels that trigger genuine agricultural and food security crisis.
This scenario is less likely than the first two, but the probability is not negligible.
The Nile is the test case, and the world is watching. Toward Sudan, toward Egypt, toward the sea.
Here is what we know for certain. A dam the world said Africa could not build, world, is built.
It is generating power. It is transforming an economy. It doubled a nation's electricity supply overnight.
It is generating power. It is transforming an economy. It doubled a nation's electricity supply overnight.
And it sits on a river that a downstream civilization has depended on for 5,000 years. It will come, if it comes at all, from the hard, slow work of building a governance system that acknowledges a straightforward truth. And the nations that share a river share a future, whether they choose to or not.
If you find this analysis is useful, subscribe. We go deep into the infrastructure,